The diner had no name worth remembering. It sat at the edge of Portland's industrial district, where the road curved away from the city and the streetlights thinned to almost nothing. The few that remained buzzing with that sick yellow glow that made everything look like evidence. The sign above the door had lost 3 of its letters years ago, and nobody had fixed it. The parking lot was cracked asphalt and dead weeds, and the specific silence of a place the world had quietly decided to forget. Nora Slade had been working here for 6 years. She came in at 9 in the evening and left at 3 in the morning, sometimes later, when the overnight girl called out sick, which was often enough that Nora had stopped being surprised by it. She wore her name tag slightly crooked because she always put it on in a hurry and never checked the mirror. She kept her dark hair pulled back while she worked. She moved behind the counter with the practiced economy of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion was wasted energy, and energy was the one thing she could not afford to waste. Most people who worked the overnight shift at a diner like this one did it because they had no other option. Nora had other options. She had chosen this. She chose it because the overnight shift ended at 3 in the morning, which meant that by 4, she could be on the number 12 bus heading west across the city. And by 4:40, she could be walking through the side entrance of Cedar Field Memory Care on the west side of Portland. And by 5, she could be sitting in a chair beside a bed in room 14 with a portable speaker on the windowsill, playing something slow and quiet, while the woman in the bed either recognized her or did not, depending on the day. She had been making this trip for 2 years. Catherine Marsh was 77 years old. She had been admitted to Cedar Field 22 months ago with advanced dementia that had been progressing for longer than anyone had caught it. There was no next of kin listed in her file. The only emergency contact was Nora Slade, described as family friend, which was the closest available category for something that did not have a clean name. Nora had met her 4 years ago. Catherine had been living in her car in the alley behind the hardware store 2 blocks from the diner. It was November. The temperature had dropped below freezing 3 nights running, and Catherine was not doing well. She was confused in the exact way that Nora recognized from years earlier from a different woman in a different city. The kind of confusion that came and went like weather that left without warning and returned without apology. Nora had brought her food. Then she had sat with her. Then she had not been able to stop. It took 1 year and 4 months to get Catherine into Cedarfield. The social services process was slow, and the memory care ward was not covered at the rate Catherine qualified for. And there was a waiting list, and by the time a bed opened, Nora had already been managing her care through a patchwork of arrangements that were not sustainable. She had known by then that she could not put Catherine somewhere worse, so she had borrowed the money. $52,000 from a company called Meridian Financial Solutions on Callahan Street, which offered short-term loans to people who could not qualify for bank financing. The interest rate was structured in tiers that escalated every 90 days. The penalty fees were stacked on penalty fees. Nora had read the contract 3 times before signing it, and had understood exactly what she was agreeing to, and had signed it anyway, because Catherine needed somewhere safe, and Nora was the only person who was going to do anything about that. That had been 14 months ago. On a Tuesday morning in February, Nora finished her shift at 3:15, tied her coat against the wet cold outside the diner's back entrance, and started toward the bus stop. The canvas bag over her left shoulder held the portable speaker and a paperback Catherine had asked for 2 visits ago during a good hour, when she had been present enough to want things. Nora did not know if Catherine would remember asking for it. She brought it anyway. The number 12 ran on reduced service before 5 in the morning. She waited 11 minutes at the stop, while the rain found the gap between her collar and her coat and made its point about February. The bus was warm and nearly empty. She rode it across the city with her bag on her lap and her right arm resting against the window. and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity. The mind needed somewhere to rest. She had learned to find that place on the bus in the minutes between one thing and the next. She had known since yesterday that they would probably come today. Meridian had sent the 60-day notice 3 weeks ago. She had called the number on the letter twice and spoken to 2 different people who both read from the same script about escalating collection protocols. She understood what that meant. She had been managing it in the only way available to her, which was to keep working and keep paying what she could, and keep showing up at Cedarfield because Catherine did not know about the letter and did not need to. When the bus stopped on Marsden Street, she got off and started toward the Cedarfield side entrance, the way she always did, cutting through the block between the bus stop and the rear service corridor. The morning was gray and wet. The alley between Marsden and the service entrance was quiet. At this hour, no foot traffic, no witnesses. She saw the 2 men before they moved toward her. She recognized the posture before she recognized the intention. The unhurried, purposeful quality of men who already knew how the next few minutes were going to go. She stopped walking. She did not run. Running had never been the calculation that made sense. The shorter one stepped in front of her and said something about the balance and the timeline. The taller one reached for her bag. She pulled it back instinctively, and the movement cost her. Because her right arm had not been right since 6 weeks ago, when 2 different men from the same organization had visited her apartment building and made clear what the first-tier consequences of non-compliance looked like. The arm was healing. It was not healed. She was working through what was available to her when she heard footsteps behind the 2 men. Not running. The pace of someone who had covered the distance quickly without needing to run, which told her something about the person before she saw the face. Step back. The 2 men turned. She watched the recognition move across the shorter one's face in phases. The initial assessment. The second look. The specific blanching of a man who has just understood something he did not want to understand. The man who had spoken was somewhere in his early 40s. He was wearing a dark coat, and he had the distinct quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to use it as an instrument. His face was not a face she knew, but something in how he occupied the alley told her he was not a passing stranger who had heard raised voices. The 2 men stepped back. She looked at the man in the dark coat. He was looking at her arm, then at her face, then at her arm again. "Get to the facility," he said. "I will find you when you are done." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the 2 men. She understood enough of what she was seeing to know that a calculation was being made on her behalf by someone with the authority to make it, and that the 2 men knew that authority and were afraid of it. She went. She walked the rest of the block to the Cedarfield side entrance and pushed through into the warm, padded quiet of the memory care ward. Hendricks was at the nurse's station, the overnight shift winding down. Nora said good morning and kept walking. Room 14. Catherine was awake. This was not always the case at this hour. She was sitting partially upright with her white hair loose around her face, looking at the window the way she sometimes did in the early morning, tracking something in the gray light that Nora could not see. She turned when Nora came in. Her face arranged itself into the expression it made for Nora, the one that contained recognition, and something beyond recognition. The face you made for someone who had shown up consistently enough to become part of the permanent landscape of your diminished world. "Your arm," Catherine said. "All better," Nora said. She set the speaker on the windowsill and turned it on. Something slow and instrumental. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was not uncomfortable. They had been past the point of needing to fill silence for a long time. Catherine looked at the window. "He came again last night," she said. Who did? The boy. In the dream. He was standing in the kitchen looking at the door, and I could not get to him. Nora waited. I left him, Catherine said. It was not the first time she had said this. She said it the way she said all the things she returned to with the exact quality of a confession that had never found its resolution and had therefore never finished. I left when he was 8 years old. I thought it was the right thing. She paused. I have been wrong about many things. That was the worst of them. I know Nora said. She had heard this before. She had sat with it before. She knew by now that Catherine could not be reasoned out of the grief, and did not need to be. She just needed someone to be in the room while she carried it. Do you think he is all right? Catherine said. I think he became what he needed to become. Nora said. Catherine was quiet for a while. Then she said, You always say the right thing. I just say what seems true. They sat together. The music played. The light outside shifted from gray to a slightly less gray version of gray, which was what passed for morning in Portland in February. Nora stayed until 6:30, then put on her coat and kissed Catherine's forehead and walked back through the corridor and out into the wet cold. She had 4 hours before her shift prep began. She used them to sleep in the narrow way she had learned to sleep, the compressed functional rest of someone who had reduced the requirement to its minimum. She did not think about the man in the alley, or rather, she thought about him the way she thought about things she had not yet fully processed, holding the fact of him at a slight distance, until she had enough information to know what to do with it. She went back to the diner at 9 that evening. He was in the third booth from the back. He had been coming here for at least 3 years. She knew this the way she knew all her regulars, not through any formal accounting, but through the accumulated sediment of hundreds of interactions that had built into a kind of knowledge. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always at 2 in the morning, always alone, always in the same booth with the torn vinyl seat repaired with electrical tape. He drank his coffee without comment on its quality, which was notable because its quality was not good. He tipped well without making a point of it. He never asked for anything she had not already anticipated. He had never told her his name. She had never asked. She poured his coffee before she reached the table, set it down, stood there. He looked up. You know those men, she said. He did not look away. Yes. You did not stop them because you were passing by. No. She looked at him for a moment. She had learned over years of overnight shifts to read people quickly and accurately, not because she was naturally suspicious, but because the overnight shift attracted a precise range of human need, and she had become fluent in its varieties. What she read in his face was not guilt exactly. It was something more complicated. The expression of a man who had just watched two things collide that he had kept separated, and was now doing the arithmetic on the collision. Who are you? She said. He told her. Declan Marsh. She knew the name. She had not known the face, but she knew the name from the letter from Meridian Financial Solutions, and from 2 conversations with a man named Bolden, who had made certain that she understood the organizational structure of the consequences she was facing. Meridian was one of several operations. There were others. The man who owned them was named Marsh. She stood at the end of the booth with the coffee pot and felt the exact stillness that came when something you had been managing in the abstract became concrete and immediate. So you own the loan, she said. Yes. The people who came to my apartment 6 weeks ago. He looked at her arm. His jaw shifted slightly. That was authorized by someone in my organization. I did not give that specific order. He paused. That is not an adequate explanation. I am not offering it as one. She looked at him. The easier thing, she thought, would be to feel more. To be appropriately frightened or angry in the clean, uncomplicated way that the situation seemed to call for. But she had used up a significant portion of her available fear over the past 6 weeks, and what remained was something more like clarity. "Is the debt real?" she said. He said no. "What does that mean?" "It means it is gone. I cleared it this morning. There is no balance, no collection activity, no one coming after you." She absorbed this. "There is no such thing as free in your world," she said. "I am not asking for anything. Everyone asks for something. Then call this an anomaly." She looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She had spent 14 months inside the machinery of what Meridian was, had felt the architecture of it through every escalating fee and every carefully worded letter, and the specific weight of her own arm in its cast. She understood that machines like this one did not simply stop for a person, but she also understood that she was standing in a diner at 9 in the evening, looking at a man who had been sitting in her section twice a week for 3 years, who had never once treated her with the quality of attention that she now understood was fear. By another name, who had set pie in front of her once without a word, and let her eat it without explanation, and that whatever this was, it was not nothing. "Thank you," she said. She picked up the coffee pot. She walked back to the counter. She did not look back at him, but she was aware of him. The way you were aware of a shift in the temperature of a room. Something altered in the atmosphere that could not be fully accounted for. He left at 2:30. He left money on the table that was more than the coffee. She cleared the booth after he was gone and did not think about the amount, because thinking about it would require her to attach a meaning to it, and she did not have the bandwidth for that tonight. The next morning, she went to Cedarfield. Hendricks was at the desk. Room 14 was quiet. Catherine was having a difficult morning, the fog thick, her eyes moving around the room without settling. Nora sat down and turned on the music and did not try to reach her, because sometimes reaching made it worse, and she had learned to read which kind of morning it was. She sat there for an hour. Then she walked back to the bus stop and rode home. She was on the bus when she thought for the first time about how Declan Marsh had looked at her arm. Not the quick social glance of someone registering an injury. Something slower. Something that contained information she did not yet have. She thought about the man named Bolden. She thought about the letter from Meridian. She thought about the distinct way that Declan had stood in the alley. Not the stance of a man intervening in something unfamiliar, but of a man recognizing something that belonged to him. She filed this and kept going. 4 days later, she found the list. She had not been looking for it. Declan had come into the diner on Thursday evening, which was not his usual time, and she had gone to refill his coffee, and he had a folder open on the table. She had not meant to read it, but the page on top was a column of names and numbers, and she was close enough to see the format before he closed it. And what she saw was enough. 64 accounts. Active collection status. 22 with a notation she recognized from her own file. First-tier compliance intervention. Her arm had been first-tier. She set the coffee pot on the table. She said, "How many people?" He looked at the folder, then at her. "How many people in Kessler are on that list?" she said. He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. She did not raise her voice. She was not built for the kind of anger that needed volume to communicate itself. What she felt was something colder and more durable, the anger of someone who has looked at the full shape of a thing and understood that their own experience was not an exception, but a pattern. She said, "I need to use the phone in the back." He said, "Nora." She said, "I am not asking for permission." She walked to the back of the diner and used the phone. and called the Kessler District Social Services Office and asked for the name of whoever handled predatory lending cases. She was told to call back during business hours. She took down the number. She went back to her section. Declan was still in the booth. He had closed the folder. She poured his coffee. She did not say anything else about it. But she could feel him watching her for the rest of the evening, with the attention of a man who had just seen something he had not anticipated and was revising his understanding of who he was dealing with. Good, she thought. Let him revise. At 2 a.m, he was still there. The diner was empty except for a man reading a newspaper at the counter and the cook working the early prep in the back. Declan had not moved from the third booth. He was looking at nothing in particular with the focused inward quality of someone running calculations. She came to the booth and sat down across from him, which she did not usually do, but the evening had already broken the usual rules and she was tired of standing. He looked at her. "Tell me about the woman in room 14, he said. She looked at him steadily. "That is not a trade," she said. "My personal business is not something I am going to exchange for whatever you think you owe me. I am not asking for a trade. I found out about Cedarfield through the loan file. I know you have been paying her care. I know she has no listed family. I am asking because I need to understand something." She sat with this. There was something different in his voice, not the controlled precision she had come to associate with him. Something underneath that, something that was working to stay contained. "I met her 4 years ago," Nora said. "She was living in her car 2 blocks from here. November. She was not doing well." "Where is she from?" She never said specifically. She had an accent from somewhere north, small town. She mentioned Oregon, but never a city. "Her name in the file is Catherine Marsh. Do you know her maiden name?" "I never asked. She just said, Catherine. Sometimes Evie." He was very still. "Her birthday," Nora said. "I know it from the facility records. March 14th, 1948. Something happened in his face. Not a visible expression. More like the absence of one, the sudden quality of blankness that arrived when a person was containing something enormous with every available resource. She watched him. She said, "Declan." He said nothing. She said, "What is this?" He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years of twice-weekly coffee, she saw something in his face that was not controlled. It was the expression of a man who has just been handed the answer to a question he had spent 30 years deciding not to ask. "My mother left when I was 8 years old," he said. "Eugene, Oregon, March of 1991. He stopped. "I have not looked for her since. I decided a long time ago that I would not look." The diner hummed around them. The grill hissed in the kitchen. The man at the counter turned a page. Outside, Portland went about its late-night business, indifferent and continuous, with no knowledge of the booth in the third row from the back, where 2 people sat in the silence of a moment that had just changed the shape of everything that came after. Nora looked at him. She thought about room 14, about Catherine's hands on the blanket, about the way she said I left him, as if it were a thing she had been carrying so long it had become part of her weight, inseparable from the rest. She thought about the photograph on the small shelf beside the bed, the one she had placed there herself 2 years ago when Catherine's good days started becoming less frequent. A photograph she had found folded in the lining of the bag Catherine had been carrying when Nora first brought her inside. A woman in a yard somewhere, laughing at something off camera, her hair loose and longer than it was, now caught in the unself-conscious happiness of a moment that had not yet become a memory. Nora had placed it there because she had thought that if the good days kept shrinking, At least there should be something in the room that showed Catherine who she had been before the shrinking started. She had not known whose photograph it was. She had not known that the boy standing at the edge of the frame, half visible at the left border of the image, was anyone she would ever sit across from in a diner. At 2 in the morning in February, she said, "I have her intake documentation at my apartment. I kept copies of everything." He looked at her. "When can you get it?" he said. She stood up. She picked up the coffee pot. She looked at him with an expression she could not have named if asked something layered and not easily compressed into a single word. "Now," she said. "I can go now." She went to the back, told the cook she needed 20 minutes, and walked out into the wet Portland night, toward the bus stop, carrying the weight of what she had just understood, which was that the woman she had been visiting 3 times a week for 2 years, the woman she had borrowed $52,000 to keep safe and warm, and not alone, was the mother of the man who had been sitting in her section twice a week for 3 years. And neither of them had known. And Catherine, in her diminished and flickering way, had known something, had kept returning to the boy in the kitchen, had kept confessing to the leaving, had kept carrying the weight of it through every foggy morning and every good hour the way you carried the things that were too large to put down, even when you could no longer fully remember what you were carrying. Nora walked to the bus stop in the February dark. She thought about all the things that had been in the same room without knowing it. She thought about the photograph on the shelf in room 14. She thought about the boy at the edge of the frame. She got on the bus and rode home and got the folder and came back. She came back in 19 minutes. He was still in the booth. He had not moved, had not refilled his coffee, had not done any of the things a person did when they were waiting for something manageable. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and he looked like a man who had been holding a structure together by force of will for a very long time, and had just been informed that the foundation was different than he had believed. She sat down across from him. She placed the folder on the table between them. He opened it. She watched him read. She had read the intake documentation herself many times in the early months, when she was still learning the system and needed to understand what Catherine's legal status was and what her options were. She knew what was in it: the name, the date of birth, the photograph taken on admission day when the dementia was already progressing. But Catherine's face was still organized in the way that faces were organized before the disease finished its work. She watched him find the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed the folder, placed it carefully on the table, put both hands flat beside it, and sat there in the silence of a man who has just confirmed something that changed the entire architecture of the story he had been telling himself about his own life. Nora did not speak. She understood that this was not a moment that needed anything from her, except presence, and presence was the thing she knew how to give. After a while, he said, "I have to go." She said, "I know." He said, "I have to go tonight." She said, "Room 14. She sleeps early, but Hendricks will let you in if you say you are family." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she did not try to name. "Are you going to be all right?" she said. He stood up. He picked up the folder. He looked at her one more time with an expression that was not quite anything she had a word for. "No," he said, and he walked out of the diner into the February dark. She sat alone in the booth for a moment. The cook clattered something in the back. The man at the counter had fallen asleep over his newspaper. The diner hummed its low ambient hum, the sound of a place still functioning, still alive in the small mechanical ways. She thought about what she had set in motion by going back to her apartment and getting that folder. She did not regret it. She was not built for regret in that particular direction. But she understood, sitting in the quiet of 2:30 in the morning, that the story she had been living inside for 4 years had just expanded into something larger than she had known it was. She cleared the booth. She finished her shift. She rode the bus to Cedarfield in the gray early morning and sat with Catherine for an hour, while the old woman slept and the music played softly from the windowsill. She looked at the photograph on the shelf, the boy at the edge of the frame. She had never looked closely enough at his face to recognize anything. She looked now. The image was small and the boy was half turned away, and the photograph was 30 years old, and the technology that had printed it belonged to a different era. But she could see the jaw, the exact line of it, the way he held his shoulders even at 8 years old. She sat with that for a long time. She went home. She slept. She went to the Kessler District Social Services office at 9 in the morning and asked for the name of whoever handled predatory lending cases. She was told the caseworker was in the field until noon. She left her name and number and a brief description of what she had. She went back at 1 in the afternoon. The caseworker was a tired-looking woman named Garrett, who had the quality of someone who had spent years in a system that underfunded the work and still showed up anyway. Nora recognized that quality. She sat across from her in a small office with a window that looked onto a parking structure and explained what she knew about Meridian Financial Solutions and the 64 accounts and the escalation protocol that had resulted in 22 documented physical interventions in 12 months. She did not mention Declan by name. She said the information had come from inside the organization and that she had reason to believe it was accurate. She had made a copy of the page she had seen on the table in the diner before she had fully understood what she was going to do with it. Garrett looked at the copy for a long time. "This is enough to open a formal inquiry," she said. "I know," Nora said. "You understand that if the organization behind Meridian finds out you brought this here, that creates risk for you." "I understand." Garrett did not ask her to explain herself further. Some decisions explained themselves. She looked at Nora with the evaluating steadiness of someone who had seen enough people arrive at hard choices to recognize when a choice had already been made before the conversation started. "Leave your number," Garrett said. "I will make some calls this afternoon." Nora left her number. She walked out into the gray Kessler afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the thin cold. The street around her was the kind of ordinary that existed in neighborhoods that had been struggling for a long time. The corner store with the hand-painted sign, the bus shelter with the cracked plastic panel, the woman walking a dog that needed a haircut. She thought about the 22 names on that list. She did not know their faces. She knew one face, her own face in the mirror 3 weeks ago, when the arm was new and the pain was fresh. And she had stood in her bathroom at 4 in the morning thinking about what she was going to tell Catherine on the next visit, because she did not want Catherine to see the cast and worry. She had told Catherine she had slipped on ice. Catherine had held her wrist gently and said, "Your arm," and Nora had said, "All better," even though it was not, because that was the kind of lie that was also a form of protection. She thought about 22 people who had told their own versions of that lie to their own people. She went back to work. 2 nights later, Declan came into the diner at his regular time. He looked different in the way that people looked different after something had moved through them. Not broken, not undone, but altered at some level below the visible surface. The way a room looked different after the furniture had been shifted, even if you could not immediately identify what had changed. He sat in the third booth. She brought coffee. She sat down across from him without asking which was new between them. He did not object, which told her something. "How was she?" he said. She thought about the room, about the low, warm light and Catherine partially upright in the bed, with her white hair loose, confused about where she was, but responding to the presence of him with the settling she did when someone sat in the chair long enough. She was awake, he said. She talked to me. Nora waited. She said she wanted to come back. He looked at his coffee. She said she did not know how. Did you believe her? He turned the question over in the careful way she had come to recognize as his actual process, not the performance of deliberation, but the real thing. I believe she thought it was true, he said, whether it was enough. He stopped. I do not know if it needs to be. She looked at him. What does that mean, she said. It means I sat with her for an hour and let it be what it was, not what I needed it to be. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside the window, Portland was doing what it did in February, pressing its cold against the glass without apology. I went to the social services office in Kessler, she said. He looked up. I had a copy of the account list, the 64. I gave it to a caseworker named Garrett. She is opening a formal inquiry into Meridian's lending practices. He was very still. You did this before you called me about the men at your apartment. She met his eyes. Yes. He absorbed this. She watched him process the sequence of it, the fact that she had acted independently before bringing him into it, that she had made a decision that created exposure for herself without asking his permission or his protection. Neither of them spoke immediately. The recalibration was happening in real time, and both of them understood it. That was not a safe thing to do, he said. I know, she said. I did it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not softness exactly. Something more like recognition. The look of a man who had spent years in rooms full of people who made calculations based on fear, and had just seen someone make a different kind of calculation entirely. He said, there are things happening in my organization. I need you to understand that decisions I made this week have created consequences I am managing. Some of those consequences may touch you. What kind of consequences? He told her about Warren Cole, about Raymond Pruitt, about the Sunday meeting being organized without his knowledge or authorization, the motion to transition operational leadership, the outside backing from a network called Galvin that had been fed information about the port operations 3 weeks ago. She listened without interruption. She had a quality of listening that did not perform itself, that simply received what was being said, without arranging it into responses while it was still arriving. When he finished, she said, Pruitt has known about Catherine for 3 weeks. He found her through the loan file when he was building his case. He has been holding the information. She is not just a person they discovered, Nora said. She is a piece of what they are going to use. Yes. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was the understanding of what that meant for the next 48 hours, and for every hour that came after. Then you need to move before Sunday, she said. That is what I am doing. She nodded. She stood up and picked up the coffee pot. She said, if something happens to her because of what you are dealing with, that is not something I will set aside. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. She went back to work. The next evening, the 2 men came. She saw them before they reached the booth. She had spent 6 years learning to read the people who came through the diner door at late hours. The gradations of need and trouble and intention that announced themselves in posture before they announced themselves in words. These 2 were dressed for the wrong neighborhood at the wrong hour, with the contained deliberateness of men who had come to say something and wanted an audience for it. She recognized the taller one from a briefing she had accidentally overheard 3 weeks ago when she had been in the back and Declan had been on the phone. She had not known his name then. She did not know it now. She knew the quality of him. The groomed precision of someone who understood that presentation was its own kind of power. His name, she would learn later, was Lenny Greer. He crossed to Declan's booth and stood at the end of it without sitting down, which was a choice about power. And the man had made it deliberately. He glanced at Nora once, a brief, pointed assessment that communicated her presence as a variable he had noted and factored. She went very still. She had learned stillness as a survival mechanism before she had learned it as a choice, and it had become by now something she could deploy with precision. She stood at the counter and held herself quiet and watched. Declan's face gave nothing. He spoke to the man in a voice too low for her to hear. The man reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the table with a precise, deliberate motion. Said something, turned and walked back out with the second man behind him. She came to the booth. She looked at the envelope on the table. "What just happened?" she said. He opened it. He read. She watched his face, and what she saw was not fear. It was the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already suspected, which was different from surprise and harder to read. He set the pages down. He sat for a moment, breathing in the steady way she had noticed he breathed when he was containing something large. He told her what the pages said. A meeting scheduled for Sunday. A formal motion to remove him from operational leadership. A faction of 6 captains with committed votes. Outside backing from the Galvin network. Framed as a proposal written in the careful language of men who understood that language could be evidence. She looked at the pages. She looked at him. "They know about this diner," she said. "The man who just delivered that envelope knew where to find me here." Yes, she thought about what that meant. Not abstractly, concretely, starting from the immediate and moving outward. If they know about this diner, she said, they know about Cedarfield. He was already looking at her. "Pruitt has known for 3 weeks, he said. She put her hand flat on the table. Not panic. A gesture of grounding, of bringing herself to the present moment the way she had learned to do in the years since her mother died, when the weight of things threatened to become too large for the available space. She said, "What do you need to do?" He told her. His voice was level. Sunday had moved up. He was not waiting for the meeting. He needed to know who was in the room before he could move, and his man Tate was already working on it. After Sunday, he said, things are going to be different. She looked at him. Different how? I do not know yet. But different. He pulled on his coat. He left money on the table. He looked at her one more time with the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic on too many tracks simultaneously and had not finished. "Go home after your shift," he said. "Not the usual route. Take the long way through the Harford blocks. Do not open the door for anyone tonight." She held his gaze. "Am I in danger?" she said. He thought about it with the honesty she had come to expect from him, which was not always comfortable but was always real. "I do not know," he said, which was the honest answer, which told her everything she needed to know. He left. She stood at the counter for a moment and felt the quality of a situation that had shifted permanently. The late-night regularity of the past 3 years had been a kind of shelter. Twice a week, coffee and eggs, the ambient hum of an ordinary place, a man who sat in the third booth and never made her feel like anything other than herself. That shelter had dissolved somewhere between the envelope on the table and his voice saying, "I do not know." She closed out her section. She told the cook she was taking the long way home, and he looked at her without asking questions. Because he was a man who had worked overnight shifts for 20 years and had learned to recognize the tone that meant, "Do not ask." She went home through the Harford blocks the way Declan had said. Nothing happened. The streets were wet and empty and ordinary. She unlocked her apartment and stood inside the door for a moment before turning on the light. Her phone rang at 8 the next morning. She did not recognize the number. She answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was a woman. She said her name was Garrett. She said she was the caseworker from the Kessler district office. She said she had made some calls the previous afternoon and was calling to let Nora know that the inquiry had been formally opened and that a copy of the account list had been secured with the district attorney's office as supporting documentation. Nora sat down on the edge of her bed. She had not expected it to move that fast. She said, "What does that mean for the people on the list?" Garrett said it meant that Meridian's collection activity was now under official review, and any further physical enforcement actions would constitute criminal exposure for the organization. It did not mean immediate relief for everyone on the list, but it meant the list existed in an official record now and could not be made to disappear. Nora said, "Thank you." She meant it from the part of herself that had sat in that office with the list and understood that the 22 names were the reason she had gone. Not her own name, not her own arm, but 22 people she had never met who had the same list of fees and the same escalation schedule and had not happened to be in the right diner at the right hour. She hung up and sat for a moment. Then her phone rang again, a local Portland number with an exchange she could not place. She answered. The voice was flat professional. The voice of someone delivering a message scripted in advance to be precise, without being ambiguous. He told her that she had been seen entering the Kessler Social Services office. He told her that the inquiry she had initiated was understood and that certain stakeholders in the affected organization were aware of her involvement. He told her that a package would be delivered to her apartment that morning and that the contents would clarify the expectations going forward. The line went dead. She sat with the phone in her hand and felt the cold weight of consequence arriving. She called Declan. He picked up on the first ring. She told him about the call. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Stay in the apartment. Do not sign for anything. I will have someone there within the hour." He had people there in 40 minutes. She did not open the door until she heard the knock, and the voice that said the word Declan had told her they would say. 2 men, professional, quiet, positioned in the hallway with the practiced unobtrusiveness of people who were very good at not being noticed. They told her to stay away from the windows. An hour later, the knock came at her door again. She opened it. Declan came in. He was wearing the dark coat. He had the quality he carried when he had been working through something without sleep. Not tired exactly, but compressed, everything unnecessary stripped away. He was holding an envelope. He handed it to her. She opened it. 8 photographs. The first 3 were surveillance images taken from a distance of Declan entering and leaving the diner on 3 separate dates. The next 2 were images of him in the alley on Marsden Street, the morning he had stopped the 2 collectors. In the 6th photograph, he was sitting in the 3rd booth from the back with 2 coffee cups between them, and she was sitting across from him. She looked at the 6th photograph for a moment. They looked like 2 people having a conversation. They looked, she thought, like people who had been talking for a long time. The 7th photograph was Cedarfield. The exterior time-stamped with a figure coming through the side entrance that was clearly Declan. The 8th photograph she held for a long time. It was taken through a window with a long lens. Room 14. The bed. The small white-haired figure in it, and in the chair beside the bed. Captured in profile, a man sitting in the stillness of someone feeling something enormous and not performing it. Declan sitting beside his mother's bed. She set the photographs on the table carefully. There was a note, she said. She reached into the envelope and took out the folded paper. She read it once. She read it again. She put it down beside the photographs and looked at Declan. He said, "What does it say?" She told him. If he did not withdraw from operational leadership by Sunday evening, the photographs and a full explanation of Catherine and their connection would be distributed to every rival network in the city. And Catherine would be moved from Cedarfield before Monday morning to an undisclosed private facility whose location would be contingent on his cooperation. She said the word contingent in the flat voice of someone who understood exactly what it meant and did not want to give it more weight than it needed. The room was very quiet. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the image of himself in the chair beside the bed. The most private moment he had allowed himself in years turned into an instrument by men who had followed him through the dark to the one place he had gone to be something other than what he was. She watched his face. There was something in it she had not seen before. Not the operational blankness, not the controlled precision. Something older and rawer and more honest than either of those. She said, "They know who she is to you." Yes. She picked up the 8th photograph again. She looked at it for a moment. She thought about Catherine in that room in the early morning, the music playing the light from the window, the quality of being tended and not alone. That was not everything and was not nothing. She set it down. She said, "You have to move before Sunday. Not negotiate, not manage. Stop them before they can touch her." He looked at her. "That means doing things that cannot be undone," he said. She held his gaze without flinching. "I know what you are," she said. "I have known since the morning in that alley. I am not asking you to be something else." She paused. "I am asking you to make sure she is safe, whatever that requires." Something moved through his expression, not the cold assessment she had seen him apply to situations that required resolution. Something that recognized what she was saying and what it had cost her to say it, and what it meant that she had said it at all. He picked up his phone. He called Tate. He said, "Sunday has moved up. We are not waiting for the meeting. I want the warehouse on the waterfront secured by tonight. I want everyone we trust on standby by 8. I want Cole's location confirmed and monitored from this moment." He listened for a moment. "As far as it takes," he said. He hung up. He looked at her. "Pack a bag," he said. "You are not staying here tonight." She did not argue. She knew exactly what was essential and what was not, which was the kind of knowledge that came from having very little for a very long time. She moved through the apartment without ceremony, taking the things that mattered and leaving the rest. The speaker, the folder with Catherine's documents, the photograph she kept on her own shelf taken on a Sunday afternoon in the Cedarfield garden 2 summers ago. Catherine in the sunlight with her eyes closed and her face turned up, not confused in that moment, just present, just warm. She looked around the apartment once. It was small and spare, and it had been hers for 6 years, and it would still be hers when this was finished. But it felt different now. The way places felt different, when you understood that the version of your life that had existed inside them was giving way to something else. She turned off the light and picked up the bag and walked to the door. Declan was waiting in the hallway. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and neither of them said anything because what needed to be said had already been said, and the rest was the work of the next 12 hours and the 12 after that. They went out into the Portland night together, and behind them the apartment sat dark and quiet, and ahead of them the city moved in its continuous way, carrying its 1,000 ordinary transactions forward into the morning, without any awareness of the two people moving through it or what they were moving toward. The safe house was a clean apartment in a neutral neighborhood on the east side of the city. Nothing identifying good locks. a kitchen stocked with the basics. Calloway had arranged it in under an hour, which told Nora something about the infrastructure of Declan's world that she had understood abstractly, but now understood concretely. She sat at the small table with a cup of tea in front of her and listened to the city outside the window and waited. Declan did not stay. He had left within 20 minutes of getting her settled. Two of Calloway's people positioned in the hallway and one in a car on the street below. He had looked at her once before he left a brief look that contained more than it performed. And then he was gone. She did not sleep. She sat at the table and thought about Catherine in room 14, and about the 8th photograph, and about the word contingent, and about 22 names on a list, and about a boy standing at the edge of a photograph taken 30 years ago in a yard in Eugene. She thought about all the things that had been in motion long before either of them knew they were moving. At some point, the tea went cold. She made more and sat back down and watched the window go from dark to the pre-dawn gray of a Portland morning that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Her phone rang at 6:47. It was Declan. She answered. "Cole has stood down," he said. "The Sunday meeting is finished. The motion is withdrawn." She let out a breath she had been holding since she sat down at the table. "And Catherine," she said. His voice shifted slightly. "There is something else." Greer did not stand down with the others. Calloway's man at Cedarfield called in 12 minutes ago. 2 men attempted entry through the rear service access 40 minutes ago, using false staff credentials. Hendricks turned them away. Nora was already on her feet. "She is still in the room," Declan said. "She is not hurt. But Greer is moving independently, and I do not know yet where he is." "I am going," she said. "Nora, I know the building," she said. "I know the layout, and I know Hendricks, and I know every entrance. And I have been going there 3 times a week for 2 years. I am going." A brief pause. "Calloway's man is at the front entrance. Do not go in alone." She was already putting on her coat. She took the bus because it was faster than waiting for a car at this hour. The early morning service running its sparse route through the waking city. She sat in the near-empty car and kept her breathing even, and her mind on the immediate, which was the only manageable thing right now. She got off 2 blocks from Cedarfield and walked the rest of the way. The building looked ordinary in the early morning light. The garden was still winter bare. The paths empty, the windows of the memory care ward showing their usual low, warm glow. Nothing that announced itself from the outside, but there was a car parked at the end of the service road that she did not recognize. Not a medical transport, not a staff vehicle. A dark sedan sitting at an angle that was wrong for a legitimate parking job. The kind of angle that said the person driving it had stopped in a hurry, or had positioned themselves for a quick exit. She did not stop walking. She kept her pace and her head level, and went through the front entrance. Calloway's man was positioned near the door with a phone in his hand. "Rear corridor," he said quietly. 2 minutes ago." She nodded. She went to the nurse's station. Hendricks was at the desk, her face arranged in the rigid composure of someone who was very frightened and containing it by force of professional habit. She looked up when she saw Nora. Nora said, "Lock room 14, right now. No one goes in until I say." Hendricks did not ask questions. She had known Nora for 2 years and had watched her navigate the facility's systems with the calm, persistent competence of someone who showed up regardless of what the calendar said. And she understood without needing the full explanation that Nora Slade telling her to lock a door was a reason to lock the door. She picked up the internal phone. Nora moved down the corridor toward the rear access. The memory care ward was quiet in its particular way. the padded, deliberate calm of a place designed to keep its residents from being startled by the ordinary textures of a world that had become unreadable to them. The carpet absorbed her footsteps. The photographs of landscapes on the walls offered their neutral comfort. The lighting was low and warm. She heard a voice before she reached room 14. Low, professional, wrong. She pushed through the doorway. Two men. One was Greer, standing at the foot of the bed in his coat hands at his sides. The other she did not know. A younger positioned near the window. Hendricks was against the wall in the corner. Arms crossed her face, a controlled mask over genuine fear. Catherine was awake. She had pushed herself partially upright in the bed, the instinct of someone pulled from sleep into a room that had changed without explanation. Her white hair was loose and her hands were on the blanket, and she was looking at the men with the unfocused confusion of a person trying to map a reality she no longer had the tools to fully read. Greer turned when Nora came through the door. He did not look surprised to see her. He had the quality of a man who had already factored all the variables and had decided to proceed regardless. "You should not be here," he said. She looked at him. Then she looked at Catherine. Then she looked back at him. She said, "Step away from the bed." Her voice was steady, not raised, not performing. The flat, certain register of someone who had no more calculations left to make and was simply stating what was going to happen. Greer looked at her the way men who had spent their careers using their physical presence as an instrument looked at women who failed to respond to it correctly. With the recalibration of someone encountering a variable that was not behaving according to the expected model. "You cannot," he started. "Step away from the bed," she said again. The door opened behind her. Declan came through. He took in the room in a single sweep. The comprehensive attention of a man trained by years of walking into uncertain spaces to register everything in the first 2 seconds. Greer at the foot of the bed. The second man at the window. Hendricks in the corner. Catherine upright and frightened. Nora standing between Greer and the bed. He looked at Nora first. Something passed between them that was not words. Then he looked at Greer. Greer said Reeve made his calls. "I heard them." Declan said nothing. "I am not here for Reeve," Greer said. His voice was even the voice of a man who believed he was being reasonable. "What happened this week disrupted the organizational structure. You made decisions that created exposure, and then you walked into Cole's office and used your name and walked out clean." He paused. Someone needed to make clear that clean is not the same as finished. Declan looked at Catherine in the bed, the small white-haired figure with her hands on the blanket, trying to locate something familiar in a room full of strangers. He crossed the room. What happened next was not elegant. It was close and physical and without ceremony, the brutal geometry of bodies in a small space, the sounds of impact and effort that belonged to real rather than performed violence. Declan hit Greer with the accumulated force of everything that had been building since the morning he had stood in a diner and looked at a bruise on a woman's jaw. The second man came off the wall. Calloway was through the door within seconds and handled him with the efficient economy of someone for whom this was familiar work. It was over in less than a minute. Greer was on his feet, bleeding from the corner of his mouth, still standing because he was the kind of man who would stand until he could not. Declan held him by the collar and looked at him without heat, without performance. "You are done," he said. "In this organization, in this city, in any building connected to anything I am involved with. If I see your face in any of those places after tonight, you will not have the option of standing." Greer held Declan's gaze with the stubborn dignity of a man who had lost and was not going to make it worse by pretending otherwise. "This is not finished for you," Greer said. even if it is finished with me." Declan looked at him without expression. "I know," he said. He pushed him toward the door. Calloway took him into the corridor. The room took a moment to become itself again. Catherine was watching the doorway where Greer had been with the uncertain focus of someone waiting to confirm the danger was gone. Hendricks came away from the wall when Calloway cleared the door, the rigidity leaving her body in one long exhale, the professional calm reassembling itself over the fear, the way it always did when the immediate danger passed. She went to the other side of the bed, checking the pulse with 2 fingers at the wrist, smoothing the blanket, using her body and her voice to return the room to its ordinary temperature. The music from the speaker had continued through all of it, indifferent and steady. Eventually, Catherine looked away from the door. She looked from Hendricks to Nora, and then to Declan. She said, "Who was that?" "People who got lost," Nora said. "They are gone now." Catherine looked at Nora, then at Declan. She said, "You came." He came into the room. He stood at the foot of the bed. "Yes," he said. She looked at him with the uncertain, reaching focus of a mind trying to place something it recognized without being able to locate the memory attached to the recognition. Something had shaken the good architecture of her remaining clarity, but not broken it entirely. "You were here before," she said. "Yes." She looked at Nora, then back at him, then at the 2 of them together. She said, "The 2 of you look like people who have been through something." Nora looked at her hands. Something moved in her face that she did not try to manage. Hendricks met Nora's eyes across the bed, with the understanding of 2 people who had been navigating this ward together, long enough to communicate without words. "I will be at the station," Hendricks said quietly. She left. Nora said, "I'm going to step out for a few minutes." She looked at Declan, once a brief, direct look that contained everything she needed to say, and did not need to say aloud. Then she walked out of the room and pulled the door most of the way closed, and stood in the corridor in the low, warm light, and breathed. She sat down on the single chair outside the door, and put her bag at her feet, and waited. Inside the room, Declan sat in the chair beside the bed. Catherine looked at him. The fear was fading now, replaced by the more familiar fog, the flickering, uncertain quality of her usual state. But she was still present enough, still in the room in the way that mattered. "You came before," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes." She looked at the window. Outside, the city was doing what it did, continuous and indifferent. The lights of Portland scattered across the darkness in their ordinary pattern. "I dream about a boy," she said. "He is always standing in the kitchen looking at the door. He asked it the way you asked things you had waited 30 years to ask carefully, as if the question might break before it finished being spoken. 'Why didn't you go back?' he said." She looked at the window for a moment. "I was afraid of what I would find," she said. "I was afraid that too much time had passed, and that he had become someone who did not need me, and that seeing that would be worse than not knowing." She stopped. "That was a coward's reason. I know that now." He sat with that. "I want you to know." She said that I thought about him, that I did not stop. She looked at him with the uncertain, flickering focus of her diminished cognition, the recognition that was never quite complete, but never entirely absent. "You remind me of him. You have his way of being in a room." He breathed. He reached into his coat and took out the folder Nora had given him. He took from it the intake photograph, the one taken on the day Catherine was admitted, the one he had looked at and understood. He set it on the bedside table where she could see it without reaching. She looked at it. "That is me," she said. "Yes. I was younger. Yes." She looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Something moved through her face, the slow, uncertain arrival of a thing she could feel the proximity of, without being able to fully grasp. She said, "What is your name?" "Declan," he said. She repeated it softly, testing it, running it through whatever remained of her internal catalog. Then she said that was his name. Her voice was different when she said it, not the recitation of a fact, something older and more fragile. "My son," she said. His name was Declan. He put his hands flat on his knees. He sat there in the chair beside his mother's bed and felt the full weight of 33 years and did not attempt to reduce it to anything manageable. He let it be the size it was, "I know," he said. She looked at him. The flickering, uncertain focus settled into something that was not quite recognition and was not quite its absence. The space where a truth can exist, even when the mind no longer has the architecture to fully contain it. She said, "Will you stay for a while?" "Yes," he said. "I will stay." She settled back against the pillow. Her eyes grew heavy. The late hour and the effort of presence were doing what they always did. She said, "I am glad you came." He looked at her. "So am I," he said. She slept. He sat in the chair for a long time after that. He did not move. He did not look at his phone or think about Cole or Pruitt, or the Galvin network or the 48 hours of machinery he had set in motion. He sat in the chair beside his mother's bed in a memory care ward on the west side of Portland and felt the distinct quality of arriving somewhere 30 years after you needed to be there, which was not nothing and was not enough, and was the only thing available. At some point, Nora came back in. She came quietly the way she always moved in this room, and she stood near the door for a moment, looking at the two of them, at the sleeping figure and the man in the chair. And then she came and stood beside the window. He looked up at her. She looked at him with an expression that was not pity, which would have been unbearable, and was not sentiment, which would have been false. It was something clearer and more durable than either of those. The expression of someone who had been in proximity to this kind of loss for a long time and had been shaped by it into something honest. She said nothing. Neither did he. After a while, he stood up. He looked at his mother's face, the white hair and the structure of the jaw, and the architecture he had memorized before he was old enough to know he was doing it, and he let himself look at it without managing what the looking cost. Then he reached over and gently placed her hand more comfortably beside her on the blanket. He put on his coat. Nora moved toward the door. They walked out together into the corridor. 3 weeks later, the weather changed. It did not announce itself dramatically. Portland's early spring was not a dramatic season. It was a gradual, tentative shift, the cold still present in the shadows and in the early morning, but the light arriving earlier and lasting longer, finding its way into places that had been gray since November. The construction sites came back to life. The park trees began their slow, uncertain work of producing leaves. The city's posture changed slightly. People walking with their heads a little higher, the winter hunch beginning to ease. On a Tuesday in the first week of March, Nora went to the clinic and had the cast removed. She stood in the hallway afterward and held her right arm in front of her and turned it slowly, looking at the pale skin where the plaster had been. The muscle thinner than she remembered the texture of her own wrist, slightly unfamiliar after 3 months of not seeing it. She flexed her fingers. The movement was stiff and tentative, the fragile newness of a thing that had healed but was not yet what it had been. She thought about what it would take to get back to where she was. The gradual patient work of rebuilding what had been damaged. The small daily choices to use what was healing even when using it was uncomfortable. She knew how to do that kind of work. That afternoon, she went to Cedarfield. She came through the side entrance and walked the corridor she knew by feel. The light fixtures in their familiar positions, the door that never fully closed on the third room down, the way the floor sounded near the nurse's station. Hendricks was at the desk. "She is having a good day," Hendricks said. "He is already in there." Nora stopped. "He came before me," she said. Hendricks looked at her with a small expression that contained a great deal. "First time," she said. Nora stood at the door to room 14. It was open slightly, the warm amber light spilling into the corridor. The same playlist she had built track by track over 2 years coming from the speaker on the windowsill. Chosen not for any quality except that Catherine had once pointed at the phone and said that one and Nora had never taken it off. She pushed the door gently and looked in. Declan was in the chair beside the bed. He had his coat on the back of the chair and his hands resting on his knees, and he was sitting in the stillness she recognized as his real state, the one beneath the operational surface, the one that was not performing anything. Catherine was sitting up, which was a good sign. On a good day, she could sit up without effort. Her eyes were clear in the way they were on the days when the fog lifted enough for real presence. She was holding a photograph that Nora had not seen before. The photograph Declan had brought that afternoon was not the one from the shelf. It was one retrieved from a box he had not opened in 20 years, larger and slightly different in tone. Nora pushed the door fully open and came in. Both of them looked up. Catherine said, "Look what he brought." Nora came to the bed and looked at it. It was Catherine younger than Nora had ever seen her, standing in a yard somewhere, with more trees, the leaves in full summer green. She was laughing with her whole face entirely inside the moment, without thinking about the moment. Beside her in the photograph, just at the edge of the frame, was a child, a boy of about 7 or 8, not fully visible, half turned away, but present. Dark hair, a specific set of the shoulders. "I was happy that day," Catherine said. She was still looking at it. "I remember I was happy." Declan said, "I know. I remember too." Catherine looked at him with the full, clear-eyed focus of a good hour. "You were there," she said. "Yes." She looked at the photograph again. Then she looked at Nora. Then back at him. Something was working behind her eyes, the slow, patient effort of a mind doing its best with what remained. "She said you came back." He said, "Yeah." She held the photograph a moment longer. Then she set it on the blanket in front of her and put both hands on it gently, the way you held something you did not want to put down. Nora pulled the second chair from the corner and sat down on the other side of the bed. The three of them were in the room together in the late afternoon light, the music playing, the city outside the window doing its work. They sat for a long time without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had arrived somewhere together after a difficult journey and were allowing themselves to simply be in the place they had reached. Catherine's head had been dropping by degrees the way it did when the good hours used up everything she had. Her hands loosened on the photograph. The afternoon had taken what it came for and was done. Declan reached over and gently took the photograph from her fingers before it could fall. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned it over and Nora saw for the first time that there was writing on the back, faded pencil, in a hand she did not recognize. "Summer 1983, it said, and then a name and a place she could not fully read from where she was sitting. He put the photograph carefully on the bedside table where Catherine would see it when she woke. They sat for a while longer in the quiet room. Then Nora stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. Declan stood as well. He took the photograph from the table and placed it in his coat pocket, then looked at her with a brief, questioning expression. She said she will want it when she wakes up. Put it back on the table. He took it back out and set it on the table. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a shift in the set of her face, but it was real and he saw it. They walked out of the room together. In the corridor, Hendricks looked up from the nurse's station. Nora said she is sleeping. Good day. Hendricks nodded with the small expression she had when a thing had gone well. They walked down the corridor and through the side entrance and out into the March evening. The air was cold but not cruel. The cold of early spring, the kind that knew it was temporary. The sky to the west had the color of the last hour before dark gray and gold. At the same time, the palette of a season that had not yet committed to what it was going to be. They walked. After half a block, Declan said, "You went to the social services office before you called me." Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She said the list had 64 names on it. My name was one of them. I was not the reason I went. He looked at the street ahead. She said, "Garrett called me last week. The formal inquiry has been expanded. The district attorney's office has opened a parallel investigation into Meridian's practices across 3 years of records." She paused. 22 cases, Declan. 22 people. He said nothing for a moment. "I know," he said finally. There was more in those 2 words than they contained on the surface. The weight of a man who had approved the operational model 3 years ago, who had looked at the revenue figures and nodded and moved on to the next item, who now knew the precise human shape of what he had approved. She did not press it. She had learned over the past 3 weeks that he carried things in his own way and at his own pace, and that pushing was not how you got to the real thing with him. The real thing arrived when it arrived. After another block, he said, she fell asleep with the photograph in her hands. "I know," Nora said. "I saw. I found it in a box in my father's storage unit." He paused. "I have had the box for 20 years. I moved it from apartment to apartment, and I never opened it." She stopped walking. She looked at him. He stopped too. 20 years, she said. He looked at the street. "When I inherited it, I told myself it was just old things. Things without importance." He paused. "I knew that was not true. I just decided to know it and not act on it." He was quiet for a moment. The box had other things in it. Her handwriting on an envelope, some letters she had sent to my father after she left, that he never showed me. He stopped. She waited. "I have not read them yet," he said. "Okay," she said. "I will." He said it the way he said things he meant completely and did not need to repeat. She looked at him for a moment. In the evening light, he looked different than he looked in the diner, different than he looked in the context of the past 3 weeks. He looked like a man who was carrying something heavy and had recently stopped pretending the weight was manageable and had started carrying it honestly instead, which was harder in some ways and easier in others. She said the photograph on her shelf, the one of her in the yard. I took that from her bag when I first brought her inside 4 years ago. I did not know whose it was. I just thought she should have something that showed her who she had been. He looked at her. She said, "I did not know the boy at the edge of the frame was anyone I would ever know." He was still looking at her. She said, "I put it on the shelf because I thought if she could not remember being happy, at least she could see evidence of it." She paused. That is all I had to offer. Evidence that it had existed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said it was enough. She looked at him. More than enough, he said. They stood there on the sidewalk in the early spring evening, with the city moving around them. The ordinary human traffic of a Tuesday, people going between the places they needed to be carrying what they carried. Living inside the private stories that a city held. Without knowing it held them. She thought about all the things that had been in motion before either of them understood they were connected. Catherine in a car in an alley in November. A company on Callahan Street with loan agreements designed for failure. A diner with a broken sign and bad coffee and eggs that were sometimes decent when the cook was in a good mood. A portable speaker on a windowsill playing music for a woman who might not know someone was there. All of it moving, all of it converging in the way that things converged in a life, if you stayed present long enough to see it. She picked up her bag. She started walking. After a moment, he walked beside her. They did not talk about what came next for the organization or for Pruitt in his supervised apartment, or for the Galvin network that Tate was addressing through channels that would take months. They did not talk about Cole's ongoing demotion, or the 6 captains, or the revenue restructuring, or the formal inquiry that was now in the hands of people Nora had put it into. They talked about Catherine, about the way she had held the photograph, about what she had said when she first saw it. I was happy that day. I know. I remember, too. The city stretched ahead of them, gray and gold and ordinary and full. The first genuine warmth of the season was still weeks away. But the cold had a different quality now. The cold of something ending rather than something continuing. And the evening light lasted just long enough that by the time they reached the corner and turned toward wherever they were going next, the sky still held a faint residue of day. Behind them, in a room on the west side of Portland, a woman named Catherine Marsh slept in the early spring evening with a photograph on the table beside her, music playing softly from a speaker on the windowsill. The city making its distant noise beyond the glass. Tended. Not alone. Which was not everything and was not nothing and was, in the end, the most honest thing that could be said about any of it.